Hello, it's been some time since I made my last video about Drupal and PHP, and I decided to come back to this and do a few videos about Drupal and OOP. And you can see here that I made a list of topics to cover, and I don't know how much will be able to cover at once. I intend to make those videos shorter so that if I work up something, that I wouldn't have to restart from the very beginning and would just redo that part that I worked up. Okay, so we intend to cover the ideas: what is a class and its methods, properties, inheritance, what's an interface, a namespace, and so on and so forth. You see that in this list. I won't read it until the end. The need for OOP is there because PHP has been moving into OOP more and more. You probably have heard some criticism of PHP that it lacked OOP a few years ago when it was in versions 5.2, 5.3 is when it just started to add those OOP, because PHP is originally just a script language, but it was in version 5 that it really started to add OOP, and in versions 5.4, then 5.5, 5.6, and then it jumped into version 7 at once. It has really brought in some powerful object-oriented programming. And Drupal 8 is based on Symfony, which is an underlying component, which is also OOP, object-oriented. So if you want to program for Drupal 8 or for modern PHP for that matter, you need to know OOP in PHP and in Drupal. So what is OOP? What does object-oriented programming mean? I intend to make it as simple as possible so that if you don't have a lot of background in PHP or programming, that you would be able to understand it. You would still require to have some basic knowledge of programming, to know what is a function, what is a variable, how PHP is installed and used. I won't be covering that. I will look at PHP and OOP based on Drupal 8. So this is the code base of Sidecat, which is just a code name for the Drupal flavor which I use with an additional theme presets and modules and so on. But it's basically Drupal 8. And before object-oriented programming, there has been functional programming. Functional programming is when you write your code in functions. Function this, and it gets these variables. Then another function with such and such names, and it gets no variables. And then you can call this function and it will do stuff for you, do what it's written to do, hopefully. The problem with functional programming, well, first you can hear that functional programming is bad, that it's not cool, that you should use OOP. And let's just say that it's not professional, it's not correct. Programming is just a way to achieve the means, and so you must achieve the means that you have. And of course there are more professional and less professional means to achieve it, but functional programming with functions can be efficient, and it's closer to the machine language. It's not that complex as the OOP, object-oriented programming. So functional programming is absolutely fine. There is no problem to write scripts using or programs in functional programming. So let's get that out of the way. But then there are still ways when you want to use OOP, objects. And this is why. Imagine a scenario when you have a very big code base. And Drupal has become a very big code base. It has tens of thousands of files with code base in it. It has its own code base, which is in the core folder of Drupal. And then it has the libraries. Even there in the core it has some external libraries. And then it has more libraries which are located in the vendor folder. More and more and more libraries. And one of them is Symfony. And Symfony in itself is very big. So basically, imagine if you have tens of thousands of code files, PHP files, and they all have functions, just functions, and each file has like 10 functions. It will be a million functions. Imagine then, it becomes very, very hard to make sure that the function names don't repeat themselves. And that's not allowed in PHP. If PHP sees that you have two functions with the same name in your code base, you're getting an error. It won't execute. So naming a function becomes very, very difficult. Another thing that happens is that when there are so many functions, it becomes hard to remember which function is where, which piece of functionality is in which file. If you have a very specific use case when you have a program which imports data from the sources and imports that data into your website as articles or web pages, you can have data as XML, you can have data as CSV, and if you have your import function that handles CSV, and then you need to switch to XML or YAML or some other format, and you have your function conveniently named import, then you're screwed because you cannot have another function with that name. So you have to rename it import underscore XML or import underscore YAML, like we have here with underscores. And that's okay also. But then if you have to substitute one function for another, and you have those functions scattered through your code base, it becomes a hellish task to do. So there is nothing wrong with functional programming, but it has its limitations. It's harder to maintain. It's harder to, the bigger your application gets, the harder it is to handle it. And then there comes, and this is with functions. What about variables? Which part of, which variable at which program has what information, and how do you get that variable from another function, from another module that somebody else has written? How do you maintain, which variable is where? It becomes immensely complex and hellishly complex. And that's why functional programming has its limitation. So we haven't started with what is a class yet. I will cover what is a class, and then I will end this small lesson and start another one. So what is a class? Programmers decided that it would be great, if they could take a certain scope of functionality. Say we were talking about importing XML or CSV. So what if we could group together functions and variables that concern import from XML and CSV into separate kind of groups, and if we could substitute one for another. Of course, one way that you could think about with functional programming, with functions, is to write include files. You can write an include file with, say, import underscore XML, and that include file can store your functions for XML. And then you just go and include that include file into your program. That's one way. But then you have to edit your code all the time. And with the big applications, you don't want to edit your code all the time. Sometimes you need to make a decision in the runtime. So, in fact, programmers developed a way to group functionality, to group functions and variables together into chunks of code that make sense. And that's what they call a class. So a class is basically a chunk of code that has functions in it and that has variables in it. And let's open one class and have a look. So here's a very, very simple class. It's this class is called XHR controller, and we will look deeper into it. And this class doesn't have any variables, but it has a function. So I could write another XHR controller if I need a different functionality to substitute for this. And then I could just call that class instead of this class. And that's very, very easy. I can go to something harder, like this plugin is also a class. It's an abstract class. Do we want it? No. Abstract class is not what I want to look now. Okay. Okay, this doesn't have any. Let's look at some other class that has children in it. I mean, not children, but attributes, variables. Layouts. Could layouts have? No. Libraries. Okay, let's look at the contrib module. Add something advanced. At entity construction kit. And let's look at the class. There are different types of classes. Like in the entity construction kit, this entity construction entity, this class ECK entity defines entity construction entity. So we have class ECK entity, and then there are classes that have forms in them, code and functionality and variables. Plugin class, routing class that tell you how to handle a path in Drupal. Testing class that automatically test functionality. Yeah, this is a nice one. So let's look at this class. We will look at it closer later when we look about methods and properties and inheritance and so on and so forth. But right now, let's just look that this is a class which is called access class, access test. So if Drupal needs to test access functionality, it knows that this bunch of code, and the rule is that one file, one class. So this access test class is this. Access test file is this class. So if Drupal needs to test access, it knows that it needs to load this file, and in fact, when it looks for tests, it goes into the tests folder and just enumerates what's in it, all those classes. So it knows, okay, if I run this class, it has everything I need to test access. It's access test. So here it has variables which only belong to this class. And then it has functions, setup, test default routes, and so on and so on. So that's easy. That's very easy and that's very comfortable, because now Drupal knows, PHP knows, and you as a developer know that if you want to check functionality that pertains to access test, to the testing of access, you need to go to the corresponding class, and the functionality is there. It's not scattered somewhere, it's not in some unknown file hidden somewhere in the depth of the system. It's a class, and you can find it in the tests folder. This is orderly, this is clear, and it really, really helps to maintain big programs like Drupal has become. Now, if you go into the entity, if you want to see what's inside that entity class, hooray, here's your entity. And then it, of course, extends other classes, and we'll talk about that later. But it's very easy. It's very, very easy and simple, and very, very logical. It's very, very smart, because you see that content, variables, and functions are kind of encapsulated, and it's actually called encapsulation. But they are encapsulated in this bunch with a name, in the class with a name. And in order to get to them, you need to get to this class, and then you can get to those functions, and you get to those variables inside of it. So this whole code base, if it's OOP, it's just based on those classes. That's it for now, and we'll resume to look at the anatomy of the class more in depth in the next lesson. I hope I haven't worked up anything yet, so I won't have to re-record this. Okay, we'll see you in the next lesson, in the next class.